Okay, it looks like we're getting close to the full number of attendees starting here or joining the meeting. So we'll go ahead and get started. Um, I'm going to go ahead and advance the slide while I do the introductions here so that you can see the instructions for CPE, as I know that that's very important to everyone. So the instructions for CPE are both on the screen right now and in the chat. So please refer to either of those two sources and make sure you get logged in right now. So good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Peplin. I'm a partner in our assurance department here at the Bonadeo Group. And we have a great program here for you today. We're going to talk about KPIs and multi-year forecasting strategies. We're going to talk about key insights in the Inflation Reduction Act and the EV credits. And I'm going to cover the updates on the related party disclosures that went into effect last cycle. Joining me is John Miller, also a partner at the Bonadeo Group. He's going to be covering the KPIs and forecasting strategies, and Jess LeDun, who's our Director of Tax and Technical, and she's going to cover the session on Inflation Reduction Act and EV credits. Within 2 weeks, we'll send you an email with the slides and the recorded webinar, so please be on the lookout for that. And also, you should receive your CPE within a similar time frame, and if you do not, please just contact us and we'll make sure that we get you the CPE. This presentation is intended for general educational purposes and is not meant to be our guidance on tax or other legal matters. So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off with the related party disclosures. And we will start with a polling question. So please make sure you answer the polling questions in order to get your CPE. Question number 1, how familiar are you with the related party disclosure requirements that were effective for fiscal year 24? Number 1, we discussed the disclosures with the auditors and are comfortable with the requirements. We implemented the disclosure requirements, but have a lot of questions. We didn't add any disclosures or not applicable. So while you're answering that, I will go ahead and continue through the presentation. So I think it's useful to start with a little bit of background. Why did this happen? So in spring of 2022, Department of Education started issuing letters to certain institutions, private schools that did not have related party footnote disclosures in the 2020 financial statements. So they were issuing the letters looking back 2 years and saying that you didn't have a related party footnote. Not all institutions received this, and some received it at a later date, but many of the organizations that we work with the private schools did receive it. And the letter talks about how Department of Ed requires disclosure requirements that go beyond GAAP. So they wanted to be able to identify all related party transactions at a level that may include the name, location, and description of the related party. And of course, with this letter that they sent out, they gave schools 7 days to issue a new set of financial statements or submit a signed statement by the institution president affirming the absence of any related party transaction. So this, of course, caused a lot of consternation amongst the institutions that were receiving these letters. Because no one was really sure what the Department of Ed was referring to, why they were asking this information. And of course, this very tight turnaround was very concerning. So when we talk about, what happened here, in the background, NACUBO and the AICPA were both interfacing with the Department of Ed, trying to figure out what exactly they were trying to do. The Department of Education requirements go beyond GAAP, and the position that NACUBO and the AICPA were taking were that these requirements were not reasonable and they created an undue burden. They pointed to the actual accounting standards GAAP and said the related party disclosures requires disclosures for related party transactions with affiliates, management, or their immediate families. So the requirement was already there. So the question was, why is Department of Ed going beyond what's actually required? And then if you look at the actual standard, as far as what the ASC 850 requires, it requires it defines management as people who are responsible for achieving the objectives of the entity, and then it gives examples. So board of directors, the CEO, COO, VPs, and other people who are in charge of similar policymaking functions. And then it defines immediate family as family members who might control or influence owner or member of management. So the first one, the definition of management is fairly definitive. Immediate family is a little bit looser, but I think generally speaking, people interpret that as spouse and children. And then the requirement of ASC 850 continues that you have to describe the nature of the relationship and a description of the transaction. It also talks about disclosing the dollar amount of the transaction and amounts due from or to related parties. So again, all this was already being required in the financial statements to the extent that any organization, including private schools and higher education, had related party disclosure or related party transactions that were material, they had to be disclosed in the footnotes. So as part of all this back and forth, Department of Ed's response was that the disclosure requirement is not new, that it was issued in 1997, but had not really been previously enforced by Department of Ed. They said that institutions must comply, and if there's no related party transactions, you had to add a footnote stating this. So if you can go back and look at the regulations that they're referring to, and indeed, Department of Ed has always had since 1997 a requirement that institutions disclose related party transactions that go beyond the scope of GAAP. So with no materiality and including information such as the name of the related party, et cetera. It's unknown why Department of Ed issued this in 1997, but didn't expect compliance with it until 2002. But that was the situation we found ourselves in. So what did we do? At the time, we said, if you have a related party footnote with material disclosures, don't change anything. If you do not have a related party footnote, add a note stating that there was no material related party transactions. And we recommended that institutions not add immaterial related party transactions or other information not required by GAAP. So that was our guidance at the time, both NACUBO and Bonadio. And that was for the fiscal year 2022 audited financial statements. So with all the uncertainty that was going on at the time, as far as why Department of Ed was asking for this additional information, serious concerns about privacy of individuals and putting that information in the financial statements, and knowing that both NACUBO and the AICPA were lobbying Department of Ed heavily to revise these requirements to not be so onerous. At the time, we just said, keep things status quo with a related party footnote, add a note saying that there's no material related party transactions if you don't have any. And that was a key there because one of the elements that Department of Ed was stating was that there was no materiality for this disclosure. So that's where, in practice, we differed with what they were requiring, and we were stating that there was no material related party transactions, but not taking the stance of saying that there's no related party transactions at all. So advocacy and negotiations continued between Department of Ed and the AICPA and NACUBO. The fiscal year 22 and 23 audited financial statements were issued with the guidance that NACUBO provided that I just went through. And we didn't really hear a whole lot. So we were thinking that it was going to continue to be okay to move forward as we had been. But in October of 2023, Department of Ed published a final regulation that not only reinforced what they were requiring originally, but strengthened it and made it effective for the fiscal year 24 audited financial statements. So the final regulation requirements I have summarized here, and I would also highly recommend that you download a copy of the NACUBO Advisory 24-01, which provides a really great summary of everything with examples. But the requirements are that all related party transactions be disclosed with the following information: the name of the related party, the location of the related party, a description of the related party transaction, and then the nature and amount regardless of when the transaction occurred and regardless of amount. So in the original guidance that Department of Ed was referring to, it used looser language such as that you should consider disclosing things such as. That language was gone. Now it's bold in black and white stating that you have to disclose the name the location, a description, and the nature and amount of the transaction. And then the other key element here is it says regardless of amount. So that removes any concept of materiality, which of course for any other disclosure in the financial statements, we rely heavily on to not put unnecessary information into the financial statements. If there are no related party transactions, Department of Ed says you must add a note stating that there are no such transactions. This is our commentary here. And when you think about it, since there's no ability to use materiality, it seems unlikely that any higher ed institution would have no related party transactions. Because as we go through with some examples here, it includes all transactions with your board members, including contributions. So and if you're stating that there was no related party transactions, you're stating that you did no transactions with any board members, no members of your cabinet or VPs or C-suite executives, which would include no contributions. It seems unlikely for most higher ed institutions. They did state that de minimis transactions and transactions to support board meetings are excluded. So when your board members are traveling for meetings and you're providing meals and lodging, that is excluded from what needs to be disclosed. Now, this part is where it gets a little interesting because in NACUBO's guidance, they talk about a mission-related exception. And they define that as follows in those 2 bullet points. So it gives an example of a university hospital that provides services such as teaching and healthcare, and to the extent that related parties are using those services, it would not require disclosure. And then also a board member receiving medical services from a university hospital or clinic, the child of a president's cabinet member receiving financial aid, or the provost's spouse enrolled in adult education classes. So NACUBO recommends these scope outs for quote unquote mission related services. We have not been able to find this scope out in any of the guidance, either in Department of Ed's technical requirements or in the actual ASC 850 standard. We've asked NACUBO where they're getting the mission related exception, and they did not respond. So I'm not sure exactly where they're pulling this from, but in general, the industry relies on NACUBO to provide guidance and support with implementing regulations, requirements, and new standards, et cetera. And so, even though we haven't been able to find the actual source of this, as an industry, we've gone ahead and adopted their suggestion here for the mission-related exception. And when you think about what they're saying here, it does make logical sense that you wouldn't need to disclose all these transactions that involve related parties who are just using the services of an organization. So it does make logical sense. Also, ASC 850, which is the actual GAAP, scopes out compensation arrangements, including expense allowances and transactions that occur in the normal course of businesses. So when we look at all these scope outs here, a whole lot of things that you might think are related party transactions start to disappear and are not required to be disclosed in the financial statements. Here are some examples. So if the president's spouse is an employee, that's a compensation arrangement and it is not required to be disclosed under GAAP. If the president receives a travel stipend for spousal travel, again, that's an expense allowance and not required to be disclosed under GAAP. And then if a board member's child is enrolled as a student and receives aid, that's mission related and not required to be disclosed under the NACUBO recommendations. And these are just a few examples that I think a lot of institutions have, and we're questioning whether they needed to put into the disclosure. But as you can see, these are scoped out for various reasons and are not required to be disclosed. And then if you look at what has always been required to be disclosed under GAAP, transactions with companies where a board member has an ownership interest or can influence management. So common examples that we see, construction company who's been engaged by an institution to do work, janitorial services, investment advisory. Oftentimes these are companies that have board members that are either owners or in key positions in management. So these transactions would likely already be material and should have been historically disclosed already in the financial statements. So to the extent that institutions already had, material related party transactions, it should have already been in the financial statements. So when you peel everything back about things that are scoped out, excluded, or already required, what's new? And the answer primarily is related party contributions. And so when you look at, who the related parties are, you're looking at board members, management, and immediate family members. And as we talked earlier about how that's defined, generally speaking, most institutions are defining management as those responsible for strategic planning and operating decisions. So officers, if a person's listed as an officer in the governing documents, they would certainly be management, the president's cabinet, et cetera. And each institution really needs to define who they consider to be management. The other element here is regardless of when the transaction occurred. So that includes current year cash and stock contributions, any new pledges that were made during the year, cash receipts on those pledges, and then outstanding pledge balances at year end. So all the different elements of a contribution from start to finish are included in here as a required disclosure. So how do we do this? Both NACUBO and here at Bonadio, we recommended the same thing. We recommend that the institutions do not include this non-GAAP portion in the basic financial statements. And there's a few reasons. It includes the names of individuals, their actual names. And we think that that's a risk to the institution and to those individuals as a violation of privacy. Audited financial statements are public documents, and to the extent that your institution receives a single audit, those financial statements are available are searchable and available online to anyone. So how do we recommend that institutions comply? We are recommending that you issue a separate set of financial statements that is only used for submission to Easy Audit to the Department of Education. And those set of financial statements should not be used for any other purpose. They shouldn't be used for the single audit. They shouldn't be used to present to the general public. They should only be used to submit to Department of Education through Easy Audit. What this means is that you may now have 3 sets of financial statements, as some institutions issue a basic set of financial statements, and then another set with the Yellow Book gas opinions that are required for the single audit, and then now a third set that would have this information for Department of Education. So that leads us to polling question number 2, which is how many sets of financial statements did you issue in fiscal year 24? 1 set that included both the gas opinions and Department of Ed required disclosures, which is what we do not recommend. 2 sets which have the gas opinions included with the basic financial statements, but the Department of Ed disclosures in the second issuance. 3 sets which are the basic financial statements, the gas opinions, and the Department of Ed disclosures, or not applicable.
Sorry, excuse me, Joe, you are no longer sharing your slides. For attendees in the chat, please be careful when you are submitting polls not to click the share button at the top of the screen, because that will steal the slides away from Joe. Thank you.
Thanks, Shan. I think we're back in business here. So moving on from the poll. All right, so I have about 10 minutes left in my allotment of time. So really quickly, I just wanted to go through some common questions that we received at Bonadio, that our clients have been asking us about. So the first question that everyone wants to know is, why is Department of Ed requiring this, and what are they doing with the information? Department of Ed's response says that the disclosures help the department identify financial relationships that could be an impediment to nonprofit status for Title IV HEA purposes. I'm not really sure that what they're asking for and what they're requiring actually accomplishes that, because as we went through and talked about what's changed, all we're really doing is adding in related party contributions with no concept of materiality. So I don't see how that really helps them identify financial relationships that could be problematic, but we'll continue talking about that as we go through these questions. Another question is that this is already on Form 990. So why doesn't Department of Ed use that information that the federal government already has? And their response was that they don't believe that the Form 990 is sufficient because it's frankly not accurate and it's not audited, which I think, is a valid response. A 990 is not an audited document. It is, it may be prepared by your accountant, but the rules on, what a tax preparer does versus an auditor does are very different. So there is much less assurance that what is in a 990 is accurate. So does Department of Ed really care about all these related party contributions? I would say probably not. And I think it's likely that they'll receive an overload of information, because the Department of Ed is using the financial statements for a purpose that they're not intended for. They're mixing GAAP with their agenda to identify inappropriate transactions, but what they're creating is something that's not useful. And my example here is that most likely an area that would be ripe for abuse are compensation arrangements. So situations where a president's child is hired as a coach and is given salary that is higher than market or higher than what other coaches are, but that's excluded from this because it's a compensation arrangement. So when you look at what's actually being added here, which is just all this information on contributions, I find it hard to believe that that information is going to be useful for a Department of Ed to identify inappropriate arrangements. But maybe they have a purpose that is not evident to the rest of us yet. And then what additional procedures are you doing for the audit? And this is Bonadio's response. We're not doing any additional procedures. The additional requirements are to include immaterial information in the financial statements. Our opinion has not changed. Our opinion is that the financial statements are stated materially in accordance with GAAP. So adding in immaterial disclosures, it does not change our audit procedures. It would be similar to if we had to add in a footnote that talked about an immaterial advertising expense or something like that. Anything that's not material in the statements, we don't spend any time auditing. So again, this requirement is not really accomplishing what Department of Ed wants, which is for the auditors to provide assurance that the information is accurate. Because it's not material, we're not testing it. Now, I think some other firms might take a different approach on that, but we're really sticking with what our opinion covers, which is that the financial statements are materially stated. Some institutions have asked, should they just not comply? What are the repercussions for just saying that there's no material related party transactions, or if they don't include the actual names of the individuals? We do recommend that you comply fully with the requirement. It is in black and white, and it's a regulation that they have issued. And we think that the risk to your institution is higher if you're non-compliant and you're at greater likelihood of being brought under scrutiny by Department of Ed, and that outweighs the cost of disclosure. Understanding that it is, a disclosure that is sensitive in nature, and that you may likely do not want to go through the process of adding these disclosures, we still recommend that you comply fully. That being said, since there's no materiality, how will we know, Bonadio, your auditors, how will we know if you don't include everything? And how will Department of Ed know if something's accidentally or purposely missed? And the answer is that we won't, and they won't either. Our audit procedures are not designed to find immaterial omissions. We do perform procedures to look for material related party transactions, as we always have, and that doesn't change. So to the extent that you accidentally miss something, our procedures are not designed to catch that if it's immaterial. So really, this is the onus is on management to comply fully and to ensure that you're providing the full information. This is one that most institutions have struggled with, which is, should the Board of Trustees approve these special financial statements that go to the Department of Ed? That's really an institutional decision. Our recommendation is that these disclosures are sensitive in nature and they're not required by GAAP. And so we don't think that they need to be approved by your board of directors or by your audit committee. This is almost like a separate compliance submission that needs to be submitted to Department of Education. Your institution may take a different approach, and that's fine, but just keep in mind that this information on what every board member contributes to the organization could cause definitely some consternation within your board. and could cause some issues with board relations. And then should we tell trustees and employees that this is being included? Again, it's an institutional decision. Generally, we recommend transparency in this issue, and by embracing that transparency and having the discussions up front, it's better to get it out of the way now than have to explain to board members or employees later on that their personal names and contribution information is being included in a set of financial statements. I think it's a better path to explain to them why this is happening and make sure that everyone is well aware of it. So that takes us to polling question number 3. What do you think about the related party disclosure requirements? The disclosure requirements are sensible, and Department of Ed will make good use of the information. The requirements are overly burdensome, but understand what they're trying to do. Department of Ed's intentions are good, but they missed the mark on how to implement them. Or finally, this information will go into a black hole and will never be used for anything. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to contact me directly. As we had mentioned before, you will receive the slide deck, and so you'll have this information when you receive that, or if you can just contact me anytime. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jess to go through the next set of slides.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. That was great. I learned a lot. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with us this morning. So happy to be here to chat about some energy credits and also just touch on some legislative updates as well. So just by way of an introduction, I'm Jess Ladon. I'm the Director of Tax Technical Service here at the Bonadillo Group. And I'm also the person who really keeps an eye on any changing legislation, new guidance. And so, of course, it's been a busy 14 days for me as we have a new administration starting and a lot changing. So I'm going to go ahead and take control of the slides from Joe, and we'll go ahead and begin this section. As a reminder, there will be additional poll questions, so please feel free, or please use Conferences.io to answer those as we move through. All right, great. Thanks, Joe. So green energy tax credits. So what are we talking about here? Generally speaking, the Inflation Reduction Act was a huge piece of climate legislation that we have seen really impact tax-exempt entities and colleges and universities. So I wanted to discuss it this morning. As you can see on this slide, generally speaking, we're talking about investment in and production of green energy. So solar panels, wind, geothermal, EV chargers, that's a big one. I know that there's a lot of universities that have been installing EV chargers or potentially buying commercial clean vehicles, plug-in hybrid or EVs for any sort of fleet that the school has. So any of these kind of green energy credits are kind of rolled under this Inflation Reduction Act umbrella. So one of the main things I want to touch on today is the fact that in the previous years, we've seen all of these Inflation Reduction Act credits being extremely focused on the specific technologies that are used. So we'd have to make sure, is this solar? Is this wind? Is this geothermal? Is this something that is eligible under the law? That actually changes as of this year. And you can see here the traditional investment tax credit or production tax credit that we've seen in past years is actually being replaced by a more broad type of tax credit. So essentially the technology piece is out the window. It doesn't matter if it's solar, wind, geothermal, anything like that. What the law looks at going forward is, does your green energy investment have a greenhouse gas emissions rate of 0? So to me, it's broadening the base of energy systems that could qualify, but it is a pretty high bar to qualify to say, yes, there's 0 anticipated greenhouse gas emissions from the project. But it is an important change as of this year, so I always want to make sure I highlight that piece. I'm going to click ahead and we will jump into a polling question. So why are we talking about this? Can tax-exempt entities utilize Inflation Reduction Act tax credits? The choices here are no, they can only utilize the non-credit incentives in the law, like deductions. Yes, they can take advantage of all the tax credit programs in the Inflation Reduction Act, or yes, but only for some of the credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, but not all of them. Please make sure you click on Conferences.io and answer the poll to get your CPE. And don't click share, please. And we'll keep moving. The poll will stay open for a couple of minutes. Go ahead and answer that. Okay, so this slide gives away the answer to that polling question. Essentially, the answer is yes, they can utilize certain, but not all tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. So I want to spend some time on this slide because it's really important. You can see the applicable credits that tax exempt entities can utilize highlighted at the bottom portion of this slide. And the mechanism that the law put in place to allow this to happen is called elective pay, or it's sometimes referred to as direct pay. And it essentially makes those highlighted tax credits refundable in the sense that a tax exempt entity can complete the paperwork, complete the online registration, submit for the credit, and then actually get a check in the amount that they would have received as a tax credit. So you can see the applicable entities listed in the middle of the slide there, but really we're talking about tax exempt entities. We're talking about colleges and universities that are tax exempt. And this really is a way that the law opened up the ability for those entities to utilize these tax credits. So I'll just kind of go through a couple of them to highlight the main ones that we see clients using. I'm going to point to the bottom two there, the clean vehicle, commercial clean vehicles, section 45W. That credit we've seen a lot of clients utilize if they are getting a commercial vehicle for any reason, and it is a plug-in hybrid or an EV, there's a potential credit there. And then the section 30 credit that's highlighted there is the refueling property, which is just a fancy way to say the charger. So if you have installed EV chargers at all, there could be credits sitting there that you can actually utilize via this direct pay mechanism. And like I alluded to, there is a pre-filing registration process. So, you know, if there is potentially eligible spend at your entity, you would want to make sure that you read up on how to qualify via the pre-filing registration. And then, of course, filing the necessary paperwork with the 990 to secure the direct pay. I did also want to point out this recent final regulation that may be impactful as you're considering potentially any applicable green energy tax credits. So this related to Section 761 regulations, and this was a notice released last year that really is a way for any entity that wants to avoid being treated as a partnership but is structured as such to actually still utilize direct pay. I'm not going to go through all the details on this slide. As we mentioned in the beginning, you will be getting the slides in a couple of weeks, so you'll be able to read this in detail if it does have any applicability to you. But this is essentially kind of a workaround effective this year that will allow organizations to be treated as direct owners as opposed to partnerships and thus qualify still for that direct pay. All right, great. So this is generally what the landscape has been since the Inflation Reduction Act came into being a couple of years ago. And now where we're at today under the new administration, I have been watching and answering questions about are these Inflation Reduction Act green energy credits, going to be on the chopping block when we have a new Trump administration coming in? And we've been kind of waiting to see what will happen. And certainly we are still in a wait and see period. But I wanted to bring you fully up to date on where we sit right now on February 3rd, where things stand. So we have seen some executive orders, as you know, quite a few that we've all been watching and seeing what the impacts will be. So I wanted to touch on a couple that would specifically impact the potential to use these green energy credits. The first is the regulatory freeze pending review. This is a pretty common mechanism that we see incoming administrations utilize to essentially just pause any regulations that have not been finalized, have not been published in the final Federal Register, so that the new administration can review them and ensure kind of consistency with that administration's goals before they're finalized and published. So it's just a pause on pending regulations. the impacts that we could see for these green energy credits are really kind of on the ones that I've highlighted on the right-hand side of this slide. A couple of the main credits that we see utilized that I referenced before, the commercial clean vehicles, the chargers, the 30C credit. Those all have kind of pending regulations that have not been finalized yet. So there is the potential for changes to those as the executive order pauses, allows agency heads to review those pending regulations before finalizing. So nothing specific that has changed, but just acknowledging that this executive order has paused everything for the time being, and there is potential changes that will impact those credits. So something to keep an eye on. Now I want to get into some more specifics about some of the executive orders. So this one, the Unleashing American Energy Executive Order, is another one that could definitely impact green energy, EV, Inflation Reduction Act credit. So what this executive order said was that there would need to be a halt on disbursement under the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law. So this really was focused on energy. This was an energy-focused executive order and said, we are going to pause disbursements of payments under those two laws and allow for the agencies, like I had said before, to kind of review the policies, procedures, and ensure consistency with the law and ensure that it aligns with the goals of the incoming administration. So those agencies have 90 days to essentially pause disbursements, make reports to the White House budget office, and then see going forward if the disbursements will be made. So we have clients, like I said, who have energy projects who are, they've already pre-registered, perhaps they've already even filed their 990s, and now there's a pause in those payments. We're watching to see what happens with this executive order and what this means, because the executive order that I talked about on the previous slide, that's a very common mechanism that we usually see under all new incoming presidents. This one kind of halting funding under an existing congressionally passed law saying we're not going to pay under this law, that's less common. So we are keeping an eye on what's happening here. I would say for anyone who has an Inflation Reduction Act energy project in the works, this is going to basically be a delay potentially or a pause or a disruption in that payment. But we would anticipate a likely still the payments being made eventually, especially the tax credits. And that's actually my next slide. I want to talk about that. So there's also, of course, additional funding mechanisms under these laws. There's grants and loans and that sort of thing. Those are certainly directly impacted by the executive order that we're talking about right now. I'm going to click over to the next slide because the question is, how does this impact the tax credits specifically that are available to tax-exempt entities through direct pay? And that is still a little bit hazy. So, the law is the law. The law would require an act of Congress to be changed. That's the way the system works. And certainly disbursements are paused, but based on the wording of the executive order, there is some sense that the tax credits are not actually impacted by the pause. There's a sense that it really would apply to the other disbursements under the law, and the tax credits may be untouched by the pause. So, as I note here on this slide, this is still unfolding. There's certainly a lot of uncertainty that's been injected into the Inflation Reduction Act by these executive orders. But for the purposes of a high-level question, are tax credits paused by these executive orders? The answer seems to be no. We do anticipate there's going to be litigation around the executive orders, the pauses generally. We've actually already seen that. I'll talk about the other executive order that I'm sure is on everyone's mind here momentarily. But we anticipate litigation around all of them. And also, I just wanted to point out my last bullet on this slide. The broader question that I alluded to earlier that I get every day, which is, under this new administration, are these tax credits just going to go out the window? I will note that a significant portion of Inflation Reduction Act funding, tax credits, all of it does benefit red states and red districts in historically Republican areas. So, with that being said, bigger long-term, more drastic rollbacks of those credits will face an uphill battle just because there are lawmakers, there's members of Congress who will advocate strongly for them to continue on both sides of the aisle. But I just want to especially note that in those red states and red districts, there is support for the Inflation Reduction Act too, which could make those long-term rollbacks more difficult. Great. Polling question number 5. Click back over into your conferences IO. Get ready to answer this one. So this one's just kind of more of an opinion. What impact do you think these recent executive orders related to federal funding will have on colleges and universities? Curious to hear your thoughts on that. Significant impact on academic programs and research? Minimal impact on day-to-day operations? Improved focus on traditional academic subjects, or just unsure? No opinion. Certainly, we're all kind of figuring it out as we go, right? The new world. So go ahead and answer through Conferences IO. That will stay open for a couple of minutes. I'm going to go ahead and click forward and talk about the other executive order that I'm sure is on everyone's mind. So we saw last week the White House Budget Office order a temporary pause on all federal grant and loan disbursement. The intention was to ensure that basically the money going out aligned with the new administration's policy goals. Of course, this caused a lot of confusion. What agencies, what programs are impacted by this? There was a lot of uncertainty. As we anticipated, we saw lawsuits immediately follow, and we did see a federal judge temporarily block that freeze in federal disbursements. Then thereafter, we saw the White House Budget Office actually rescind the memo that really laid out the agency, or really laid out the pause to federal grants and loans. But we did see the administration acknowledge the executive order does remain in place. So where does this leave us? This is really an ever-evolving situation. I would encourage, if there are questions about specific loans and grants at the federal level, that you refer to the White House fact sheet. There is a White House fact sheet that was put out on the memorandum, which, of course, the memorandum has now been rescinded, but the executive order remains in place. And that does include a list of programs that were not implicated and should give some sense of relief as far as some of the, I know HUD, some of the individual spending, scholarships, things like that, that the White House has said would not be directly impacted by the executive orders. So high level, we've seen President Trump come in and pause on a lot of things. And that's certainly a disruption. But we have seen those pauses be rolled back in some instances. We've seen the memos rescinded. So we're really keeping an eye on this situation. I would say, you want to monitor this closely, refer to that executive order that I just referenced, work with your trusted advisors. We're certainly here to help make sense of it, as, to say that it's changing by the hour might be an understatement. So we are here to help. And I hope that gives you kind of a sense of where things sit with Inflation Reduction Act, energy credits, and some of the legislation and challenges around that. I'm going to put my contact information up on the screen so that you have that. And please feel free to reach out to any of us with questions around this. And I will wrap up my section. Thank you for having me, and I'll turn it over to John next. Thanks, John. Also, before I totally switch over to John, if there are questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I can monitor and assess and answer some questions there. And I know we'll have some Q&A time at the end. All right. Thanks, John.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Jess. They say in presenting, it's always a matter of who you follow. That's going to make it easier or harder for you. So I guess I'm going to have a harder act to follow with Jess, with putting very highly technical information and ever-changing information into what I would say something actually fairly simple to understand. Last Tuesday, Jess and I met to go over her slides and say, hey, are these on point? Is this what we're thinking about? while we were reviewing what these executive orders and what needed to change and ever changing. So I think she did a good job saying, here's what the current update is on it. The other item just mentioned as well, put the questions or comments in the chat. We will have times for questions. What Joe and Jess have gone over so far is some very highly technical information. I know from sitting in the meetings, certain meetings, that not everyone maybe has a complete good view on what the related party disclosures are, or even what Jess was talking about related to the tax credits or Inflation Reduction Act, as well as what I'm going to say. So, or maybe just use it as a form of a question just to get something off your chest to give us a time to respond to it as well. So what I'm going to talk about now is using what we'll call scenario and planning and impact analysis to make better decisions. And what does it? What do we really want to get through over the next? Depending on how many questions go in the chat, over the next 45 minutes or over the next hour and 15 minutes. So that's also a little bit. If you want to hear me drone on for an hour and 15, if you don't want to hear me drone on for an hour and 15 minutes, put comments in the chat. But really, what I want us to understand is the higher ed environment is ever changing. It's changing at a higher velocity and speed than it's ever changed before. So we need to understand what our organizational strategy is, but actually how we effectuate and how we implement that strategy and how we have the right systems to track that set strategy. And how we do that is through key performance indicators, or you'll hear me say KPIs, and analytic. Then also we'll talk about scenario planning. I think that's going to be important, especially what Jess was just talking about. Many clients Tuesday afternoon saying, is our funding going away, versus where they ended up on Wednesday, and how scenario planning can think about that. And then what the connection is between strategy and choice, and how to use everything and put it all together. And hopefully from that, we can have an actionable change. All right. So I don't really have to tell this group, so more or less reiterating it on how, as you heard me mention earlier, the velocity, the speed of the changing, how it's kind of a curveball. We don't know where it's coming and when it's going to come. It's hard to pick up on. All industries it's happening to, it's happening in higher ed as well. One of the things I always bring it back to is think about something you did a year ago. Think about something you were doing 6 months ago. You're no longer doing that. One of them, some of you that have done some of the Windows upgrades, whether, we see in this chat right now, or we see in this Teams meeting right now, folks signing in with their AI and saying, I'm going to have that take meeting notes to go out. We weren't doing that a year ago. Sending your emails. Now, as you start to write an email, it will you say, hey, let me finish the sentence for you. Is this what you want? That's the speed of the change. And that AI is coming. It's being used in admissions. It's being used in learning analytics. It's being used in your institutional operations. Is your institution keeping up with the other institutions that are using AI? Then with the more use of technology and data, obviously comes the cybersecurity challenges, and that's always a moving target to keep up with. We've seen workforce challenges, faculty and staff recruitment, faculty getting burned out, administrative staff getting burned out. Then who's going to replace them? How can we create a better work-life balance for them? How can we prove our value and worth to them? That is an increasing challenge. Economic pressures. We're seeing declines in enrollments, especially across the Northeast, an increase on tuition dependency, or what is really the schools that are tuition dependent. Those declining enrollments are creating financial pressures for them. The rising cost of operations, though we're seeing inflation after those historic highs a couple of years ago, starting to flatten out, but what we're not seeing is deflation. And a little bit of a sidetrack, based off of what a couple of things that happened this weekend at the federal administrative level. What is that going to do to our business? What is that going to do to our cost structure if these tariffs come through? Are we going to start seeing the cost of goods and service going up? Those are things we got to think about. Financial aid pressure and increasing student debt. Then finishing it out is now we're seeing alternative education providers in the space that we used to be in, and whether it's local or regional. So now we have to look at our traditional business model and say someone's carving out a piece of it and they're taking a part of our market share. How are we responding to that? And students are demanding innovation and program offering. And then lastly, there's social and cultural shift. There's changes in demographics that's occurring. And what I mean by that is the typical population you've already served. Also looking at older or what I would say non-traditional students, or students saying, I only want a piece of this form of higher ed. And how does that influence behavior in the workforce? Over the holidays, there was one of our family friends, their son was 18, and told me he wants to get into business, and he was thinking about going to a school for business. And I was going to kind of give him the talk up and say, accounting is a great skill set. You should have that. There's so many things we're going to do in accounting. He sat there the whole time and asked me questions about certificates and what does this certificate mean? Would an employer look at a certificate any differently? Because what he wasn't looking to do was spend 4 years going to a business school to come out with a degree that an employer didn't value. I thought that was a very interesting conversation. I will say, so everyone knows how it was finished, was I said, I've known you for 18 years, and I know you don't take an easy way out, and sometimes you just have to do the work, whether you think you need it or not. But there is a very specific example of a cultural shift. All right, so now that I kind of scared you, but it's important to lay the groundwork. Again, I think you all knew that, but what it does is it lays out really the rest of this presentation. This is not a presentation on how we're going to set organizational strategy. It's more of a presentation on how we're going to monitor and revise it. But I think it is important that we understand how the organizational strategy is set. Typically, all organizations, including higher ed, they have a vision, mission, and values, and that sets the strategy. So the vision is, what are we trying to achieve as an organization? Where do we want to go? Often I'll say this is, what is your North Star? What do you want to look like when you grow up? Sometimes I'll say that. Or what do you want to look like when we're all gone in 30 to 40 years? What will the organization look like, and will it be sustainable? The mission is, why do we do what we do? Generally speaking, to this group, we provide higher education. Some of you might further dive into that mission, be very specific, whether it's a religious domination in that specific way of providing higher ed, whether it's a public university and say this is the type of population. But generally speaking, the mission is why you do what you do. Values. How do you differentiate yourself? This is often, I'll say, your core values, your fabric, your culture. It's often hard for institutions or even us to write down what makes us different. Why are we successful? How do we differentiate ourselves in the marketplace? But it is a process of setting your organizational strategy to understand how you're going to differentiate yourself, because then from there, you're going to invest in other things. And then strategy that leads right into it. Where will you focus your efforts? So if you say, this is where we want to play, or this is what we want to do, this is how we're going to win, or this is how we differentiate ourselves, where are we going to invest our efforts? What are we going to focus on? From what I said in the beginning, we need to change how our traditional business model has been because of all those forces coming down on us. And that is where the strategy is. So I say all that, again, this is not a setting strategy presentation. It's more on how we monitor it. So what does all that mean? So the organizational strategy, what that does is it guides the long-term vision. Where do you want to go? Sometimes though, what I see is organizations, obviously nobody on this call or nobody on either side of this, what they do is they sit down, they start a strategic planning process, they invite a consultant in, they spend the next year to 18 months from really, we should do this, to they pop out a document, they have something, it's very nice, it's printed on really good paper, it comes around, all the employees receive it, they make it available to the public, sometimes they have a press release. They make it available and they say, this is what's going to guide us. Often the only time it's often seen again is when when your president or a CEO has to bring it back to the board members and say, this is what I'm doing. Where we have to get and we have to think about is strategy is, when I say it's a set of choices, the decisions you make every day. And yeah, sometimes it is. When I come in and what do I do? Start at my computer and I have a cup of coffee. Do I talk to someone? But the decisions you make every day need to be integrated into that strategy because of all those forces. So that means if you said this is how we're going to differentiate ourselves, or this is our mission, what are you doing daily or weekly to actually effectuate that strategy? So really what I'm getting at also too is your organizational strategy can't be something that sits on the shelf in the president's office and is only brought out quarterly for that board meeting. It needs to be something front and center that you think about as well. All right, polling question number 6. What do you think your institution's most pressing challenge in today's higher education landscape is? So by now, get into the Conference IO app and put it in there. I was able to see one of Jess's responses on how they affect the executive order. I just think it's kind of timely as it relates to this presentation. As you answer this question, is 1/3 of you believe the executive orders will have a significant impact on your programs and your grant and how you execute what you do. That's really important, especially as we think about the strategy and how it could be shifting and how we need to react or not react to it.
I'll jump in too, John. Thank you for citing that. I didn't actually see the results of that, so I appreciate you pointing that out. And of course, I was focused kind of on energy credits and the payment of tax credits, and that, obviously much more broadly, there are so many potential impacts under the new administration that we will be watching, whether it's D&I, immigration, there's a lot of visa action happening right now, increased attention on those, so there's a lot of things, Title IX, there's certainly things that I think, broadly speaking, are going to require certainly, expert assistance, because really just keeping an eye on everything that's happening and the potential impacts from a federal level it's a full-time job plus. Yeah. So there's a lot there. Thank you for citing those results.
Yep, you're welcome. And if someone wants to go in and cite the results while I'm presenting, I can bring it back to this as well. So getting back to the presentation, the foundation of strategic decision making and the power of intentionality. So intentionality, what that means is when you're making a decision, every action you take is aligned with a clear purpose back to your strategy. When you have what I would say unintentional choices, or you're making choices that don't relate to your strategy, that results in inefficiency. It results in waste. It also results in misalignment, and then having to get back and get everyone back online. So the institutions that succeed are those that are able to make deliberate and proactive choices based off their data. So what are reactive choices? Reactive choices are, you looked at the enrollment data and then you decided after all the students came on campus to do something about it. Reactive choices are saying you're looking at your budget shortfall and saying, well, we must need to cut because we have a budget shortfall. Also adjusting academic programs just based off of short term and who's there and who's taking that class that year. What it means is you're not thinking about it long term. You cut budget or you make a cut in expense that you had as part of your long-term financial plan that might impact your ability to get there. So what are proactive choices? Proactive choices are making investments. You can see it's focused on deliberate actions. Are you using predictive analytics to tell you what's going on in the enrollment marketplace? Are you using analytics to say, why did the students this year take this class versus not taking that class? Analytics to look at your retention rate. Are you being predictive with your student and tuition rates and fee rates as well, and what the financial aid models are, and how do those align with a long-term goal? So basically what I say sometimes, it's staying the course, controlling what you can control, but being proactive in it and using data to as we see, to make intentional choices. All right, so what do KPIs have in this? Basically a long way to finally get to KPIs. So your key performance indicators drive strategy. They're measurable values that track your progress. So, sometimes we'll say if it's worth doing, it's worth measuring. One thing before I get too deep into what KPIs are and aren't, a lot of people think, as we say, it's measurable. They're numbers, they're values. I do also recognize there can be saying, we will do this. Did we do it? Yes or no? That is a KPI because that does tie to your strategy. So there are going to be times, it's not always something that's, behind the scenes in a calculation that comes out and it's shared. There are sometimes it's just words and yes, no, or a timeline. Why are they important? I think it's pretty obvious. It's laid out there, but they're important because one, they provide benchmarks for success. If KPIs are included in the strategic plan, they're going to say, this is where we want to be. This is what we want to grow. It's letting you know, are you on course? And if you get off course, then you have the data and you can make decision making. How do we refine this? This is what the KPI is saying to us. This is what the data is saying to us. And again, it's aligning a team around a shared goal. It's something everybody can agree on from the all the way from the top down. And it's not that what I talked about earlier, misalignment. This is what's important to us. This is why we're working on it. It's important to us today and this week as well. And everyone's in alignment. So how to choose the right ones? Again, I think it's fairly obvious, but make sure they align to your institutional goals. If you have an institution, if you set out the 4 things you want to do in the strategic plan, make sure the KPIs you're tracking have something to do with it. Have something to do with those. Make them actionable. We got to do X, Y, Z along the path. We have to, as part of getting retention up, we have to have more student engagement. We have to have more opportunities to force student success. We have to take action on doing them. And then balance leading and lagging indicators. So what do I mean by leading and lagging indicators? Is leading indicators are ones that help you predict the future. So some of those could be your admissions funnel metric, course registration trends, student engagement, what the financial health metrics are, such as the tuition discount rate. And then also, as we think about the workforce, and I mentioned that too, a leading indicator can be employee satisfaction and turnover rates. That's telling you how you're leading indicator on how you're managing your workforce. Versus a lagging indicator, they are important though, just because, lagging sometimes you might think of it's behind. Lagging indicators do have importance, but what they do is they confirm past performance. So some examples are, what was the enrollment numbers? So who did show up in the fall? Financial numbers as well. When you look at some of those financial numbers that come out at the end of the audit, those are lagging indicators. Retention rates, it happened in the past. This is what it was. It's a lagging indicator, as well as graduation rates. All right, so some examples of KPIs that I see in higher ed being tracked. What I did on this slide is I put them into 4 buckets and said here's some common ones. Some to talk about that I've experienced or seen is in some examples is yield rate. So a lot of the institutions will say, oh, what we want to do is we know what our market is, we know where we go to. If we can get more of a yield rate for those that are accepted, and we can increase that yield rate, it's important for us to look at, because ultimately that will end up in another student, another tuition, and financial sustainability. Others will say, okay, not only do we want yield rate to go up, but we just want overall more applications. So they'll look at it that way. Where I've seen a couple institutions, they said, we're getting more applications, but now our yield rate is going down. So in essence, all the work they did to increase the size of their funnel was basically all for naught, because they weren't monitoring that yield rate that went down, and now you have the same amount of students. Retention rate is very similar. As a couple universities that I have worked with in looking at what their financial plan is and how they budget and what they're looking at over the next 10 years, it's really interesting to see the retention rate and how much of an impact that means. When they increase their retention rate by 2 to 3%, how much that results in additional FTEs on their campus. It's something that they've been looking at, and really what they say is, if we can be at what the benchmark is, or maybe a little bit better. That one institution I work with, that was 20 more students each year, 20 more FTEs, just to be at the benchmark. Another one that has been getting looked at, and sometimes we can talk about it on both sides, so I don't mean it to be negative, but also this could be an indicator when I talked about earlier too, is don't make a snap decision on it, is the faculty utilization rate. So schools are starting to look at and say, well, how many students are in this class? Or what is overall, is our faculty to student 15 to 1? But digging a little bit deeper and saying, well, how many students are taking this class? And then from there, understanding, what does that mean? If your faculty utilization rate is lower than you want it to be, asking some questions. It's not always just about the faculty. What building is it in? What time is it in? Or then you get, is this really matching up to what the students want today? We've seen schools looking at that faculty utilization rate and considering things from campus wide. All right, financial KPI. So this is the space as an accountant I live in a little bit more. So what are some of the key ones we look at? Obviously listed here. One of the ones we look at is that net tuition per student. And I know at the end of a lot of our audits, we do the benchmarking, and I know others look at this. I've seen them through the NACUBO studies as well. But what we generally want to see is that net tuition per student going up. Everything I said earlier as it relates to increased costs. So we want to see that going up. But how does that match up to the discount rate? So we see colleges looking at their discount rate, looking at their tuition per student, net tuition per student, and understanding how that impacts their cost structure. And the other one we see managed a lot too is the current ratio. Again, that's a lagging indicator, but what that is showing is the short-term financial strength of your institution. Generally, how much cash and receivables do you have to versus what you have to pay out in payables, accrued expenses, and debt the next year? And really, that indicator is saying how strong are we in the short term? Where that really can impact you is your ability to make these further investments into your strategy. So a higher current ratio would mean you have cash available or you to make these investments. Or if you have to take out debt, they're going to look at that and say, well, what could the rate be? Or could you even take out debt as it is? All right, next polling question. What areas of investment is the most critical for your institution's success in the next 5 years? Jess or Joe, did you get to sneak in and see the results of some of my other questions?
Yeah, we did. And actually, Kelsey pasted a screenshot into the chat. It looked like for the last poll, almost 75% of folks chose maintaining affordability while ensuring financial stability as the most important current consideration. So definitely a resounding vote for that choice.
It's at 75%. So
Just about.
mhm. So this is a slide that I've put together, but I've also thought about, and I've shared this recently with a few of my clients to say we do need to have more KPIs to drive performance. Where do we start? And I think one of them is that your KPI should look like a triangle. The CEO or your president should not have this in their cabinet, should not have the same KPIs as maybe a faculty, maybe even the controller or the individual that runs your facilities. It should be coming down from the top like this. So as an example, I talked a little bit earlier about the retention rate. So at the strategic level, at the organizational level, the president, their cabinet, and the board say we need to drive financial and operations sustainability. We're going to need to increase our retention rate to be 5% plus 5% over what the benchmark is. That's their KPI. What they're going to do from there is they're really going to go maybe a little bit at the cabinet level, but a department head level, and they're going to say, all right, what do we do for the retention rate at this level? You're going to set different KPIs. So retention rate, making examples, is student engagement and student success. So maybe at the cabinet level, they're going to say, well, I'm going to start tracking student engagement. How often are students involved coming to extracurricular activities, coming to special days we have on campus, taking part maybe in an admissions process. And then student success, they might look at and say, well, what are the grades? How are, the time to graduate? Are they staying on track? From there, they're going to go a step below it. And maybe following these two examples is really on the student success. You're going to go down to the granular level, the bottom level, the third part of this, and you say, all right, student success. How many students are coming to tutoring we're offering? Is it moving in an increased direction or a decreased direction? And what does that mean for us? In a student engagement is, I mentioned earlier, how often are students engaged? Are students coming to more basketball games? Are students coming to more plays? Are students coming to more speakers you bring on campus to talk about societal issues? If it's moving in the right direction, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? So that's kind of the process for moving from the top down of setting an overall goal at the strategic level and moving it all the way down. So that's kind of what I talked about earlier is those daily and weekly choices and what you're tracking as you move down the triangle. All right. So how do you really do this? And I think some folks will say it's intuitive. I've been working on a client, not in higher ed, but we have been trying to set a KPI for 4 months related to something. So I'm going to try to analogize it a little bit here, but I would analogize it to say, and let's analogize it to faculty utilization rate. And what they've been looking at is what's the utilization rate and is it accurate? And right now, the faculty in this hypothetical example is disagreeing with how many students would be in the class. The faculty in this example is saying, I take attendance every day, it gets reported, but I also don't trust what you're doing. So I'm actually also keeping it in my phone as well. Because then when the numbers go through the system and they get the attendance reports, they're saying, well, you only had 10 students take this section in this class. And the faculty is saying, no, I had 13. They don't trust each other. So part of doing all this is not pulling a number out of the system. It's really what I would say is having a culture and really shared understanding of what the KPI is you're tracking, why you're tracking it, what the number should be, what the benchmark should be, and where it's coming from, and first gaining alignment and agreement on what you're doing. So you can see there, an example is, the first step is data collection. Where are you getting the information on how many students are in that section, how many are showing up, and how many are being successful? First, everybody agree on this is the data we're going to pull, and is it accurate? From there, you're going to go into a data processing and analysis. So someone is going to clean the data. Again, this doesn't have to be like Fortune 500, someone behind the scenes just running all these pivot tables and turning it and making it something great. A lot of the systems you already use, especially the systems that you purchase into, should have reports for this. And if not, you could actually ask them to, maybe put a help desk ticket in and see what it is. See if they're capable of providing it. From there is you do report. So you want to make visuals, dashboards. I often say when I work in the healthcare space, make something as simple the smartest doctor could understand it. Maybe in here, make something as simple the smartest CFO can understand it. But you want them to look at it, get the most information they can from it, be able to make a decision quickly and say, I get what we're saying there. I get we're saying faculty utilization in this class is going this way. And I can look at, or this section is going this way. And I can look at every section that's occurring at 7 o'clock on Tuesday night in XYZ building that's off all the way on the other side of campus, and I can see the same thing. So maybe what I want to do from there is maybe move the class or move the time. Then, and this is a continuous theme of what I talk about, is now you have the data, now you're reporting it, now you're saying, should we take actions on it? Now you got to monitor it. You got to say, okay, we took this action to get this KPI to move this way. Let's monitor it. Does this make sense? Let's track it month or maybe weekly, monthly, quarterly. So does it make sense? Then lastly, start using those insights. How does this relate back to the organizational strategy? Are we moving in the right direction? Are we making improvements? Or what we learned, faculty's utilization ratio has nothing to do with the building half mile off campus. It just has to do with the time. It has to do with what's being taught or what's being taught. So now you're making a decision on that. So that's where you're improving the decision making. All right. So now kind of switching it up a little bit. That's how to use KPIs to make better decisions. Now we get into scenario and impact analysis. So it is a little bit different. What is scenario analysis? You can read it there. It's the ability to explore multiple scenarios. I remember really during COVID when it first came in and when it first started about 5 years ago, all of you were just getting into your budget cycle. And you're saying, well, we have no clue what enrollment could look like. So from there, I had one institution told me they had a average, bad, worse, worser. And for most 4, they had another 4 scenarios of each of those. Sometimes I might say, well, geez, now we're up to 16 or 20 scenarios. I don't think you really have 16 or 20. I think you have a couple buttons you can press and say, well, what if this were to happen? What would it really look like? But there's an example of an institution that's part of their budget basically set 20 scenario analysis. The other thing often I'll get pushback, or they'll say, well, do you really expect that to happen? Or sometimes, that liquidity footnote we all put into, well, the privates put into their financial statements about 6 or 7 years ago. And we say, well, this is how much liquidity you have. Or we'll say, you really have 120 days cash if not another dollar came in. And they'll say, yeah, but what's really the chance of that happening? Of course, always another dollar is going to go in. We always say, yeah, but you just want to see it trending in the right direction. Well, I think there was a point last Tuesday, I had many institutions saying, wow, that really is the reality. Maybe another dollar might not come in for another 90 days. What are we going to do? What I would bring that to is, have we scenarioed, have we impact analysis? What if in the major program you had, or your enrollment, what if it got cut in half by 50,000 or 50%? Or what would happen if financial aid said, you know what, we're not cutting another financial aid check for this semester till we finish our 90-day review to make sure you're in line with federal administration priorities. It's not that far-fetched anymore in the environment we're living in. So do the scenario analysis and this impact analysis. So you can see here, maybe not as draconian as I just said, but what are some examples? Is think about what happens if your enrollment increases or 10%. What would that do to your cost structure? What would that do to your workforce if it went up or down 10%? What if we invested in this new equipment? The faculty and the department head and the cabinet member are saying, if we're trying to get into health sciences, we need this new piece of lab equipment, or we need this whole complete building because we got to compete with so-and-so down the road. What is that going to look like? What's the scenario from that? What if we changed our price? We had a different tuition discount program. I know a lot of the institutions have looked into really saying, we don't just, we go with that flat price. What would happen? Running scenarios for that. Product launch, new programs. If we start to get into more, maybe let's say a data analysis program, or getting less away from some of the traditional programs we have, what do we expect to come in? What if we have certificate programs? What would that look like? And then workforce turnover. What could happen if all the faculty said, you know what, I'm not ready for this change. We're gonna leave today. What would that look like? Do you have enough faculty to support all the students in the enrollment you have? So those are examples of scenario analysis. All right. So how do we do it? We identify a scenario. I'm going to use maybe the COVID example versus what's kind of happening now. We identify a potential scenario where our enrollment could get cut in half because we're not sure how we're going to operate the next year. We're not sure if students are going to be allowed to come back on campus or not. So that's something that really did happen. That scenario. So how are we planning? How are we planning for that? Maybe a little bit less might be, we have a new competitor in the space. That's a scenario. Are they going to take our market share? From there, we start saying, what's the disruptions? How could this impact us? And what should we do? So we identify those unusual circumstances. Unusual, there's a pandemic. Folks can't come onto campus. That's pretty unusual. What variables could that affect? That's going to affect our enrollment. That's going to affect our tuition. That's going to affect room and board. That's going to affect the facilities. And you start to list and you say, what can go down this list? Then you start thinking about other economically. What could the impact be? What could the impact be economically, as we saw in the impact of our supply chain? Or what I would say is, you're paying increased it caused inflation to go up. So your costs went up for your goods, services, your food prices went up. And from there, you develop plausible scenarios. The key word in here is plausible as well as realistic. I've seen some do scenario analysis where you sit back and you say, is that really, I know we want to plan and we want to think about these things, but is that really really reasonable to think that all, as I said an example, that all of your faculty would leave on the same day, or 20 or 75% of your faculty? It's not really reasonable, especially if we have KPIs that show us what our faculty think. So it is, we want to think of all these ranges, but we kind of want to be, within what I would say within, think about it like a bowling alley lane. We want to have a lane of how far we're going to go out. From there, we're going to assess the impacts. Okay, so if this were to happen, what would we look like? How would we continue? How would we continue our operations? What would we cut? And when we make a decision, what would we cut? If we cut our faculty, if we said, you know what, we're not going to do this new program, how does that affect your long-term strategy? If you said, we're not going to do this new program, or should you be making a decision somewhere else?
And I think that ties into the evaluate the alignment with the goals as well. In making sure in all these scenarios that you're not reducing something that's going to impact long-term for your organization. Develop those contingency plans, outline. Sometimes maybe obviously, those contingency plans maybe only sit in the CFO's office, CFO's office, the provost, and the president, because you might have a list of this is what we're going to do and this is what we have to change. You really don't want that out getting public, but at least someone's thinking through that. I'm seeing a little bit of that right now. Some of the clients I work with in the healthcare space, that their cash is just not trending in the right direction, and trying to coach them and say it's hard, but you basically have to have a list ready to go for heaven forbid you go into negative cash. What cuts are you going to make? You better have that list at least able to open up your drawer, but outlining and having that contingency plan. And then obviously review, monitor, and adapt, much like KPIs. What are we learning from this? Where are we going with these scenarios? What did happen, even if we don't have like a huge impactful scenario again, like a pandemic, or the financial aid getting cut, or these tariffs really increasing the cost for us to do business, still something happened. Are we going back? Are we learning from it? Are we saying, hey, cost of business went up 15%. What did we do? How can we learn from that to do a different scenario analysis? All right. This is our last polling question. What is your institution's primary focus for innovation in the coming year? And also, what I will say, I got about 3 slides left. So the questions and answers session is going to start. So please start using that chat. Again, popping things in. I know you have questions on the related party disclosure because of what Joe was talking about. I still scratch my head on saying, really, that has to be disclosed? Or really, we're going to have 3 sets of financial statements, one for the department head, one for everybody else. And I know, based on the calls I've been with Jess related to that, the IRA and the EV credits and all of that, that is super complex. I know some of you are doing it. You've already done it. So you probably have some questions on, hey, I've already done it. What do I need to do today to see if I'm available for a credit?
Thanks, John. I have the results from the last poll too, so just wanted to talk about those for a second. So the question was, what area of investment is most critical to your institution's success in the next 5 years? We had almost half of the respondents choose enhancing student retention and graduation rates, but a very respectable showing at almost 35% for developing new academic programs aligned with market needs, which I thought was kind of interesting in light of your conversation with your family friend too. Certainly watching that trend.
Yep. So 2 things from that is when I think about strategy, one, yes, the 35% is meeting the market need. Is what will the market do? What will the bear? I think that's important with 35%. But 50% have said graduation and retention rates. So 50% of you are working on getting that retention rate up. And let's just say 50, generally speaking, that's you want to retain 10 students. Just remember that's 10 less students in the transfer portal that are out there for somebody else on the call to get. So, thinking about that retention rate, if everybody's working on it, it's eventually, I'll put it this way, not everybody can be successful at it. So that's going to be something you think about with 50% of you, or it could just be, listen, those 10 students that aren't staying, it's not as though they're going to a different institution, they're dropping out. So maybe that goes to the 35% programmatic rate.
That makes sense. Just a reminder to make sure you click into Conferences.io and answer the polls to get your CPE. That'll stay open for maybe another minute. Thanks.
All right, let's kind of bring this home. So, what I've talked about is we start at the strategy and we say, what can we do every day to think about how to effectuate the strategy? You as business officers of your institution, you're really the key driver. You're the quarterback for this. And sometimes, whether you like it or not, you are that quarterback. I remember maybe about 10 years ago, I was talking to a controller and I remember saying, well, why is that your problem? And they say, well, they think everything's my problem because they think I have the money to solve it all. So they just bring every problem to me. But you really are that quarterback. You really are that alignment of where does the data come in? Where does the financials and really where does the financial piece of it coming in because you're looking at what to invest in, but you're also reporting on those lagging indicators about what was or wasn't successful. And ultimately what was or wasn't successful is the margin that you had or did not have that year. So you set the goals and really, again, set at the top level, set at the cabinet level, set at the board level. And you bring that in and you get everyone aligned and you align them through those KPIs and make sure that you have those different KPIs at each level. If you remember the triangle ahead, then from there you execute. You have to take action. You have to be intentional with what you're doing. Those KPIs should be intentional, but really what you do every day should be intentional to your overall strategy. Then lastly, you measure it. You say, were we successful? Or are we not successful? And what does it mean? What does the KPIs mean because we were successful? Why, or what we weren't successful? Why weren't we successful? Is it what we thought it was, or do we have to take a little bit of a dive deeper into the data? All right. This is kind of shows how a lot of it comes together, and I liken it to, well, it is a puzzle piece, but where I kind of thought about this, and it coming together, what was my mother-in-law, when she comes up, she always brings a puzzle. So she'll come up for like a week, and sometimes we all go to work, the kids go to school, and she'll stay at home, hang out with a dog, and do these puzzles. And I was thinking about, she puts it up in front, and she says, here is everything. Here's the picture of what I'm trying to do as it comes together. And often, I'll come home and say, oh, this piece is here, or we start somewhere. We start, always start around the edge of it. But really, all four of these things, though they're different, they all need to come together. We need to have KPIs. We need to be doing the scenario analysis and understand how it changes. We need those strategic goals to start from the top to guide us. And we need the data and analytics. We need to be pulling those reports really to understand what it is, analyze it, and feed it back into the KPI scenario analysis, and then inform the president, their cabinet, and the board on where you are with those goals. All right. So the takeaway strategy, I keep saying this, intentional choices, use KPIs and data analytics to help you refine those. Use the scenario analysis to ensure you're prepared for when we get an executive order on a Tuesday and no one's interpreted what it really means by the end of the day. And then lastly, look at how you're making those decisions. Are you making data-driven decisions, or are you doing something that you did 15, 20, 30 years ago? All right, there's my contact, but I think most of you know me and how to get a hold of me. So we're going to see if there's any questions in the chat, or if Joe or Jess were thinking something about their presentation as well that they wanted to go back to.
Yeah, I just want to touch on the results of the last poll, John, so you know. So what is your institution's primary focus for innovation in the coming year? We had about 38% choose increasing the use of data and analytics for decision making. And then runner-up was 29% at streamlining administrative processes for efficiency. Pretty even split between some of these. So certainly a lot of competing issues for the folks on the call today.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it is good. I guess that will make the presentation I did timely, is over a third of you said we really want to look at these data analytics, what we're pulling out of the system, who you're the software systems you're investing in, and what their capabilities are, and what it's telling you. And the other two is streamlining efficiency. We go back to the beginning with the cost pressures, and I think I've done a presentation with this group before, but it continues to be relevant. It is really, how efficient are we? Where are the redundancies? Are we automating? Are we automating systems? Sorry, the chat got me. Are we automating systems where we can automate them? One of the things I say is, are we working at the right levels? And what does that mean? Is the CFO the one booking journal entries, or is the controller the one booking journal entries? Who's doing the reconciliation versus the review? Operational efficiency too is working at the right levels and leveraging it appropriately. So you saw me take a pause, so that means a question came in. This one looks like it's going to go to Joe. For the schools who filed their related party disclosures to the Department of Ed, have they received any correspondence about what they submitted?
Thanks, John. As of now, I have not heard of any school who has received any correspondence back from Department of Ed on the submission, but many schools have not even had to submit it yet, because the deadline follows It's different than your single audit deadline, but it's essentially the same deadline, 9 months after your year end. So there hasn't been a lot of time for Department of Ed to receive and process the information yet. But to date, I haven't heard of any correspondence back. While it's on me, John, this is off topic, but I was thinking about other things to discuss, and one is the employee retention credit. We've had a number of questions come in from clients who have not who have applied for the employee retention credit but not yet received the funding, and so the questions are surrounding have we seen an uptick in institutions receiving the funds from the government, or denials or anything like that. And so if you recall, the federal government put a pause on the employee retention credits. It was a while back now, but you could still submit for the credit, but they put a pause on reviewing any new ones because their concern was that there was so much fraud and abuse coming in that they needed time to get through the backlog of all of the applications that had been submitted. So they had reopened it, I think in early, at some point in 2024, they had reopened and started examining the submissions again. And we have seen an increase in correspondence from them to clients who are still waiting. And it's mostly been asking for additional information or denials. So we haven't seen a large increase in actual payments out, which is probably not surprising because of sort of the political environment that had occurred surrounding the employee retention credit, where over time, a lot of Congress realized that there was a lot of bad actors who had been submitting for it, and it was widely publicized in the press. So to the extent that we have had clients get denials, we are assisting them with letters, trying to explain why they are eligible. And for those that are requesting, where they've been requested more information, we're obviously assisting with that as well. So I would not expect any good news in the near term on payments being made if you still have an outstanding ERC. They should eventually get paid, because if you did everything that you were supposed to and you're eligible and your application is right, even if they are sort of grinding the wheels to a halt, eventually it should get paid. But from an audit perspective and in your financial statements, if you have a receivable for the employee retention credit, it may be a good idea to start thinking about whether there should be some sort of allowance against it, or if you will receive the full amount or not. And if you're just submitting now, which I know that some organizations are still submitting applications for the credit, I would suggest that you don't record anything in the financial statements until you receive it. So if you've already recorded something, you might want to consider an allowance, or especially if you receive a denial letter or something like that. But if you are just submitting now, I would suggest a wait and see and take a cash basis approach on that. But that's my suggestion. Your auditors, or if you have a different partner than me, may have a different suggestion. So don't take it as gospel. But I think with all the uncertainty surrounding it, and some of the actions that have come from the Trump administration surrounding freezing of funds and everything else, I would not anticipate that it's a slam dunk at this point.
Totally agree. Freezing of funds, and just to add, freezing of hiring at the IRS too. That's a big one too, that we'll see potentially less action.
Well, I've known Joe for 25 years, so I'm still going to take everything as gospel. So Jess, I know last EV credits, and really for a lot of those chargers. So, last Wednesday I dropped my daughter and her friend off on somebody who's on this, but I know many of your other institutions have already installed these EV chargers. I know many of these institutions are either have already done, such as looked at lighting or heating projects, and I know some are considering it. So maybe if they've already done these chargers, what are the options to be even evaluating if a credit's available?
Yeah, I mean, it's a potentially pretty large credit when you consider the 30C credit potential there. So there's anywhere from a 6% to 30% credit on what you spent on those EV chargers. And that 30% can actually get bumped up even higher, depending on if you're meeting certain wage and apprenticeship requirements, domestic content of the charger. So there's a whole bunch of, like you said, it's complicated. But the number one question that somebody should be asking themselves if they have installed an EV charger is whether or not they are in an eligible location. So that specific credit is location dependent. So you are only going to be eligible for this credit against your EV charger installation if your location falls into a specific spot. So generally they're looking at more rural locations, non kind of metropolitan areas. We are able to help, clients run the address and make sure if they're in kind of an eligible tract or not, but it is location specific. So that's going to be kind of your number one question. Is my location eligible? That's going to either give you the yes, this is something we should pursue, or no, I'm not even in the right zone. This isn't gonna work for me. So I would encourage anyone on the call that has installed EV chargers or is looking to install EV chargers to reach out to us so we can just do that quick check for you. See, okay, you are in an eligible location. And then from that point on, we'd assess, when the EV charger was put into service, how much was spent, if you are still kind of in the window to apply, and we'd help you go from there. But that's going to be kind of the number one question for that specific program. And I
Well-
did have someone chat, this is on the same topic, someone chatted me internally and said, what about transferability of the credit? So I want to talk about that very briefly. I touched on direct pay, which is the mechanism for tax exempt entities to utilize green energy credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. There is also transferability, which generally speaking just means you secure the credit and then you sell it to somebody else. That is not applicable to tax exempt entities. That's a completely different mechanism under the law for essentially actually the other types of entities, everything but tax exempt entities, to try to kind of create the credit, sell it, transfer it, etc. So that is not something that would be applicable to this group, which is why I didn't touch on it. So just to address that question as well.
What if they were early adopter on the EV and it was in 2022 and they put it in?
Well,
How far
22
back or can they go, if at all?
Yeah, 2022 is a question mark, because of
I was
when
just
the
pulling it out of
inflation.
the air. I didn't
Yeah.
pick a hard one.
23, I would more confidently say we could still potentially pursue that credit. 22 may be going a little bit too far back, but it does kind of depend on the entity, their fiscal year, their filing, all of that. So we would still want to have a conversation around that. But certainly 2023 and on, we would definitely want to pursue the credit if, again, you're in an eligible location. And that's simply for the EV chargers. You also want to think about, have we put in new kind of geothermal, even like windows? We've had conversations with clients who have put in more energy efficient windows. There could potentially be deductions there. There could be other forms of offsetting those investments. So we would certainly, have those conversations too. So really think broadly about kind of green energy initiatives on your campus.
Right. I've had one institution and also one hospital I work with. They essentially tell me that they have their own power plants, and I kind of like, you have your own power plant? And they actually said, for the most part, we do, and we actually create and generate our own power. And that's where I said I better get them in contact with Jess to think about,
Yeah.
is there something we can be doing in the future?
There's so much there. If you're generating, we want to look at and compare, was your initial investment in that system and the credit potential there, is that bigger? Or maybe it's actually the production of that energy going forward that you can get a incremental cost back on the production that could potentially be more beneficial. So we'd evaluate all of that. And in that instance, they may already be generating more than enough, selling some back to the grid. There's so many potential incentives. And I want to make sure that everyone on the call knows this isn't something that just went away when Trump took office. We're obviously keeping an eye on the new administration's energy goals and how they are different from the previous administrations and what may be changing. But these incentives are still there. The law is still in place. Despite the fact that there might be some pause on some disbursements, the law is still the law. And we want to help you guys take advantage if there is money on the table that you could utilize.
Any others in the chat that came up. I can think
I
of
just
related party
pasted-
transactions for, I can ask Joe a related party transaction question, but maybe not as exciting.
Yeah. I just pasted in there the ERC timeline from one of our publications just to kind of enhance what Joe was talking about as far as the moratorium, the pause, and we're always waiting to see more of those processed through.
Joe, last year when you were discussing the new related party transactions, you were meeting with the audit committees, and some of them that would actually pertain to them, and it could be very specific. What was the level of pushback you got? And I ask because really the group on here needs to start preparing their audit committee and their board members to say there's going to be disclosures, and it might be very, very specifically getting reported to the department head. So what was the level of pushback?
So it ranged anywhere from one college said that they didn't really think it was a big deal. They were just going to inform their board members and it didn't think that there was going to be any pushback on it, to another institution where their internal legal counsel got involved and really wanted me to provide all of the background information, all of the publications from Department of Education and the AICPA and NACUBO. And, I compiled it all together and sent it to them for review. I think it's almost like the bigger the institution, the more concern they had over it. Maybe that's just a coincidence, but I think it's, once you get into a larger institution where there's, maybe some significant contributions coming in from board members, that I think that's where the concern is. And at the IACUBO conference, there was quite a bit of discussion on this too. And I had put in the Q&A, should we just not comply? And there was some larger institutions who were implying that they were going to not comply with the regulation, just put a footnote in there like we had been doing, saying that there's no material related party transactions. And their concern, and I never did get a good answer on this either, their concern is that this information could be foiled through the Freedom of Information law. And even though, we're saying, you're only submitting this one document to Department of Ed and it's not going anywhere else, their concern was, could someone still foil that information and get it? I had reached out to NACUBO to see if they had any idea on that, or if they thought that was a real risk. They were looking into it and I haven't heard a response back yet. So everyone just keep in mind that, we and NACUBO and you all are doing our best to implement something with very little guidance. And we don't know what the end result will be. And so we're making the best decisions we can on the information we have. Obviously, I think that for those on the call, there's probably less of a concern that your information will be foiled as opposed to Harvard or Stanford or something like that, where there might be a political agenda in foiling the information so that someone can make a case about whatever it is that they want to put into a negative light, right? And so the question is, like, if a large institution gets foiled and they say, well, look at these contributions coming in from these liberal donors or something like that, I think that is the concern that people have.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like the 990 Schedule B, the reason it's not publicly disclosed is actually under freedom of speech, and it goes back to the civil rights movement. Is they didn't want to know who was funding a lot of the civil rights organizations. The other part of too is my worlds intersected last night. Is I found a website for college athletics that's able to actually use all the publicly available information. And you can't see specific donors, but you can see a lot, like how these college athletic programs are run, what their debt structure was. So I was having fun with one of my friends last night saying, oh, it looks like your school's below the top 50% quartile for donations. What are you doing about to get this new coach? But also to that point is the private schools actually do not have as much information publicly available. So that speaks to your point. And then Jess, I think one question came in from me. So let's see what it is. And then I think then we will sign off unless something pops in.
Yeah, you had talked a little bit, John, about AI very briefly in the beginning, and then obviously the KPIs and measuring those. Have clients been utilizing AI technology to create and monitor and track KPIs? Is that something that we're seeing? Is that capability there? I'm still kind of new to Copilot and ChatGPT? Like, is that being utilized for that purpose?
I will say, and this is not to say this is the base on this call, maybe some of the larger institutions on this call are using the AI technology to do some of this work, but the clients I typically work with are using the AI like a ChatGPT, like a Copilot
Mhm.
to do the work. I will say I'm someone that will put things into ChatGPT to see what comes out. I do have a premium subscription. Sometimes I'll mess around and I'll get a big data report and I'll say, hey, just put it in here. Let's say what could happen. Obviously, no identifying information or anything like that.
Mhm.
What could happen? Or I know our firm is piloting Copilot. We'll say, tell
Mhm.
us a story here. I don't think, to me, what I see in those systems is not really good enough to get someone actionable information, or
Mhm.
you're going to spend just as long as if you just did it. I'll always come back to Excel as the first AI. It's the first, and it probably will be the last. We always thought something would take over Excel, and it just continues to churn
True.
along.
Mhm.
So from using those formulas, it's always been good. But that's not saying that there, also what is AI? To me, it's a little bit of predictive analytics versus something
Mhm.
just telling you what to do. I do see, especially a lot in these enrollment, is really the ability to predict what type of student you're going to get and where you should put your efforts. And I think we're going to see
Mhm.
predictive in terms of even the retention rates that I know 50% of you said we want. I think
Right.
they're going to be able to use some of those concepts I talked about, engagement. Um, are they going, of your student body who participates in XYZ student success? I think you're going to be able to start because you're going to take all this information and put into databases and items are going to come out. But again, I'll always go back to, and as much as they try to say it's going to get to this spot, and I've, in my spare time, I listen to some of these podcasts that tell me the robots will take over the world and all this. I don't see where it is today on critical thinking. So someone's still going to, even if you have AI do it all for you, I still think someone needs to sit there and say, you know what I've learned over the last 40 years is that human behavior is not predictable. And I'm going to sit there and say, this is what my gut says. It's really about marrying those up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think, yeah, for something like KPIs potentially as a starting point, and then of course having to use your actual human brain to
Mhm.
assess that. But I mean, we see the same thing on the tax side. There's obviously so much potential there, but the need for critical thinking and fact checking anything that comes out of an AI or large language learning model, anything like that, you're gonna wanna fact check. So yeah, completely agree
Mhm.
with you there. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Seeing no more questions in the chat, we will be signing off. But again, as we mentioned, well, the presentations will be routed around in 2 weeks. And again, also we thank the Upstate New York College Collaborative. Again, continue to do this in connection with you. We really appreciate working with you. I always say if you have, to this group, whether you're in the unique or not, is if you have a topic or an idea or say, we want to learn more about this, can you help us with it? Get it to us. All the topics we brainstorm, we think about. When Joe goes to the Nakubo or the Iakubo, we always go back and we talk with Saranda, who then brings it back to the bigger group. So really, these sessions are based off of what you felt was important, not what we felt is important. So thank you very much for your time this morning, and hope everyone has a great week.
Thank you, everyone.
And as a reminder, please make sure you check out of conferences.io before you sign off. Thanks, everyone.